This Parsha class is brought to you by IntentionalJew.com, the home of the Intentional Jew Podcast Network.
Okay, this week's Parsha is Parshas Toldos, and there's a lot of very beautiful messages in the beginning of the Parsha. There's the events are amazing, and the messages are amazing. I want to deal with one thing this morning, and if I finish a little early, then I'll deal with the second thing. But the Torah tells us after the boys are born, and all of that, the drama of the birth. And then the Torah tells us about Yitzchak's relationship with Asaph, that Vayav Yitzchak is Asaph, Kitzayid Befiv, because he hunted and he put food in his mouth. V'Rivka Eves Yaakov, and Rivka loved Yaakov. Then the Torah tells us of the event where Yaakov bought and Asaph sold his Bechora, his first rightship. Vayozid Yaakov Nazid, Vayavo Eisav min hasada v'hu ayef. So Yaakov was making soup, and Asaph comes in from the sada, and he's ayef, he's exhausted. Now it's curious what Yaakov was doing, making soup. Yaakov was not, Julia Child. He wasn't on the cooking channel. He was a Yoshev Olim. He sat in his tent and he learned Torah all day. It was a little bit out of character for him to be cooking. And we'll see what that is in a minute. Vayomer Eisav Yaakov, Asaph says to Yaakov, Halatini no min adom hazeh, give me the red stuff. Ki ayef anochi, because I am exhausted. So Al Kain Karash Shmei Edom. That's why he was called Edom, because of the red stuff. That in itself, I'm not going to deal with that this morning, but that's a curious thing. You call him red because he liked red lentil soup. It's weird. There's nothing wrong with liking red lentil soup. So you call him red, which is Edom is not a pleasant name. Okay, continuing on, Yaakov says to him, Michra chayom es bechoras chalis. He says to him, so I want you to sell me the Bechora, the first rightship. Vayomer Eisav, hine anochi holech lamus. He says, look, I'm going to die. V'lam ezel li Bechora. What do you need Bechora for? I'm plotting. I'm so exhausted. I can't live without this soup. So I don't need the Bechora. Vayomer Yaakov hishavali. Yaakov says, swear to me. Kayoim ve'yishavalo. He swore to him, and he sells his Bechora to Yaakov. Yaakov gives to Eisav lechem unizira dashim. He gives him the red soup. Vayochal vayesht vayokam vayelech. Very telling pasuk. He ate, he drank, he got up, he left. No, thank you. No, appreciate it. That was geschmack. Nothing. Vayelech vayivez Eisav es habechora. And then that section of the Torah concludes with the words, Vayivez Eisav es habechora. That Eisav despised the Bechora, the firstbornship. So the questions I want to ask on that section is that what was Yaakov, let's go back to that, what was Yaakov doing making adashim, making red lentil soup? So Rashi says that V'osa hayom mes Avram, on that day Avram died. And Avram died earlier than the other Avos, because God didn't want him to see the Esav ben Beno, his grandson, his Amical Esav, Yotzei l'tarbus ra. You don't want him going out to see that what Esav was doing, the negative, nasty, bad things that Esav was doing. Now, what were those terrible things that Esav was doing? Well, when Asaph came into the house, what did Asaph say? Asaph said, Ki ayef anochi, I'm exhausted. And Rashi says, what does ayef anochi mean? Ayef anochi means that he's exhausted because of murder. He was involved in ritzicha, he was involved in murder. We know that he was involved in adultery. We know that he was involved in pretty horrific things. But Rashi says that he shouldn't see the tarbus ra'ah. And what's interesting, the only bad thing that it says about him in the Torah is that he hated the Bechora and he sold his birthright. Do you mean to tell me that that's the reason why Avram died early, so that he shouldn't see his grandson sell the Bechora? What's the big deal? If we wanted to keep Avram from seeing the bad things his grandson did, so then, and the Torah wants to make a point of that, then why doesn't the Torah say, and by the way, he was a murderer? But it doesn't say that explicitly. It doesn't say that he was a thief explicitly. The only explicit sin that is attributed to Eisav is that Eisav hated the Bechora and he sold it off. Is that what the Torah is telling me? That selling the birthright is the worst thing in the world? It's not a doraisa. It's not a Torah commandment. He hasn't transgressed anything that was written in the Torah. Why would it say it, giving the impression that Avraham Avinu was being saved from witnessing that moment? What was so terrible about that moment? Also, you have to wonder, at the very end, like the story is over. Asaph has his conversation with Yaakov. He says, I don't need this Bechora. He gives him the Bechora. He gets up, he leaves. Done. It's over. And then the Torah throws in this little dagger and says, Vayivez Esav es ha-Bechora. Esav despised the Bechora. Why do you have to despise the Bechora? He just sold it. Who cares what he felt about it? Who cares that he despised the Bechora? He sold the Bechora. He got rid of it. He gave it over to Yaakov. So his relationship with it is clear that he's not a big fan of it. He doesn't feel that he needs it. He feels it's superfluous in his life. But why does it have to be Vayivez? Why did it have to come to the place that he hated it and he despised it and he belittled it? So I'll tell you an amazing thing. When a person has something valuable and they don't respect the value of that thing, and then come to a realization that the reason why they've lost that special thing is because they didn't value it, they're at a crossroads. And they have two ways to deal with it. They could either confront their own shortcoming. They could look at themselves and say, it's my fault. I can't believe I let something precious fall through my hands like that. Or they can look at it and say, it wasn't really worth anything anyway. They can denigrate the object, denigrate the thing, denigrate the person, denigrate the opportunity, rather than confront their own shortcomings. And sometimes it's easier to do it that way. I could either deal with my inadequacies or I can run it down. I'll give you a mashal. You turn to a child. The child's acting up. You say to the child, you do that one more time, you're going to get punished. And the child does it again. And you say to the child, you can't go to that birthday party you wanted to go to. Child has two choices. They could turn to the parent and say, you know what? I didn't realize that what I was doing was so bad. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I apologize. Or a child can look at the parent in the eyes and say, who cares? I didn't really want to go to the party anyway. I hate parties. Now, when we see it in a child, it's like childish behavior. But adults do the same thing. Adults, when they look at certain things and they realize that they're not going to achieve them, so then they say, oh, I never really wanted that anyway. That's not really what I was gunning for. It's not really what I was hoping for. It's not really what I wanted. I wasn't aspiring to that. Rather than to look at it and say, I was, but I didn't do the right things to get to that place. You know, when you take a person who looks at another person, and a lot of times we're filled with hatred to other people. We don't usually admit that, but we're filled with hatred to other people. And we think that the reason why we don't like them is because we don't like the things that they're doing to us. But very often, we look at another person and we see them succeed in the very thing that we could have succeeded in, but for whatever reason, we didn't press it hard enough and we didn't succeed. We didn't put in the appropriate efforts into that moment, into that thing. Rather than to look at ourselves and say, you know, I think that the uncomfortableness, the shortness falls in with you, it's much easier to look at the other person and to say, that person, can't stand that person. so that I don't have to confront the fact that that person was successful, davka, in the very areas that I was a failure. A lot of times, rather than to deal with ourselves and rather than to look at ourselves, we turn it towards another person and we say that it's your problem, just so that you don't have to confront it. When somebody gives you criticism, they give you tochacha, and the tochacha is spot on. You have two choices. You can either say thank you, or you can think in your mind, that person is a fool. That person's out of touch. That person, it's not what they said, it's how they said it. And all of that allows you to be able to deflect having to deal with yourself. That's what the Torah is telling me. The truth that the Bechora meant nothing to him, that he was willing to sell it for a bowl of soup. The bowl of soup was being made on the day of the yahrzeit of Avraham, the day of the death, of the burial of Avraham Avinu. Yaakov Avinu was making a soup because it was a sudas havrah. It was a meal of condolence, of comfort that he was going to feed to his father Yitzchak. They had just come back from the Levaya. They had just come back from the Ma'aras HaMachpelah, and they finished burying Yaakov. They finished burying Avram. And Asaph walks in. He was hunting. He was murdering. He was doing all of his things. And he walks in and he sees them. He sees Yaakov cooking this bowl of soup. And he doesn't say to him, hey, what just happened? Why are you cooking soup? All he can see is that soup. Give me from the red stuff. He didn't even have enough kuth to be able to say, give me from that red lentil soup. It's just that red stuff. And he said, why lamali bechora? What do I need the bechora for? And then he woke up and he realized that it meant nothing to him. And he realized, though, at that very same moment, that it should have meant something to him. It was the Bechora, it was the firstbornship, it was really the leadership of the Jewish people. It was an important place in the world and in world history. And that moment was so damaging to Asaph. He had one of two choices. He could have looked at himself and said, I blew it. I need to rehabilitate myself. I need to get a new view and vision of life. Or he can vayivez Eisav es haBechora. He could say, I didn't want it anyway. I can't stand it. It's a weight around my neck. He can look at it and see, call it something negative. He can denigrate it so that he doesn't have to deal with it. Asaph was totally devastated by the guilt that was generated from feeling that he was inadequate and that he couldn't muster the self-control that was necessary to do the right thing for his life. And by denigrating it, he no longer had to confront himself and deal with those shortcomings. And that's what the Torah is telling me is the worst thing in the world. And that's what Avraham Avinu was shielded from, that he shouldn't see his grandson behave that way. Because not wanting to deal with our problems, thinking that you can just remove the irritation, means that you aren't dealing with yourself at all. What comes out of that? Murder. Adultery. Because murder, I'm looking at a person, you annoy me, you're bothering me. I could either look at you and say, what am I doing? I'm doing something wrong that you and I are having this terrible relationship. Or I can just say, I need to get rid of you. I need to remove you from my life. Rather than to deal with myself and my input here, I look at you and I say, I need to remove you. by denigrating, by removing the source of irritation, means that I refuse to work on myself. And when I refuse to work on myself, so many things grow out of that. And the root of Asaph and his issues was the fact that he refused to deal with himself. He has taivas, he has desires. You can look at that and say, what's going on with me? Why am I not able to control myself? Or you can look at it and say, you don't need to control yourself. Whatever you want, you can go and take, go and get. That's the way Asaph lived his life. The murder, the idolatry, the adultery, all of that were only symptoms. They were outgrowths of the real issue that Asaph had, which was that he refused to confront himself and to deal with his own issues. But what's amazing is that you have to say that Asaph had a deep understanding of God, a deep understanding of what was right and what was wrong. Because if he didn't have that deep understanding, then he never would have felt guilty. He never would have stopped for a moment to think about, maybe I'm doing something wrong. No, I'm doing something right. Like he wouldn't have even thought to redirect himself, because he wouldn't have thought that there was anything wrong. The degree of his anger was a reflection of the degree of his guilt. Had he not thought that the Bechora was important, then he never would have hated it. He never would have had to hate it, because he gave away something that taka wasn't important. The words that it wasn't important were only words. He understood how important it was. By the way, what was buried along with the pairs in the Ma'aras Machpelah? Adam and Chava, Avraham and Sarah, Yitzchak and Rivka, Yaakov and Leah, and Esav's head. The Medrash talks about how Asap's head was chopped off by Hushim ben Don, Hushim the son of Don, when they went to bury Yaakov. Asaph wanted to stop them from burying Yaakov in Ma'aras Machpelah. They brought him from Egypt to bury him. And he said to them, do you have a deed? Is it yours? And they said, we have a deed, but the deed is back in Mitzrayim. So Asaph said, you got to go get it. So they sent Naphtali, who was a fast runner, they sent him back to get it. In the meantime, there was a grandson of Yaakov's, Hushim was his name, the son of Dan, the son of Dun. He was deaf, Hushim, couldn't hear. And all he saw was that his uncle, his great uncle, was degrading his grandfather, that he wouldn't let him be buried. So Hushim said, what's going on? But he couldn't understand the answer. He couldn't hear anything. So all he knew is there was a degradation going on. He picked up a sword and he chopped off Asap's head. The Medrash says that Asap's head rolled into Ma'aras Machpelah. Why do I have to have that image? What was wrong with just killing? He's killed Asaph, and Asap's head dropped to the floor, and the wicked witch is dead, and everything was great afterwards. And Dorothy went home. Why do I have to say that Asaph's head rolled into Gan Eden? Because Asaph's head belonged in Gan Eden. It belonged in the Ma'aras Machpelah. Because Asaph's head understood everything. It's his body that he couldn't get it to his body. He couldn't translate it into his life. But his head understood. Asaph, if you would have in his heart of hearts asked him, Asaph, is the Bechora important? He would have said to you, man, it's the most important thing in the world. But because he couldn't get his body to live that way, so the only way that he could deal with it is by saying, no, it's not important. But that was only an external thing, not internal. This is an unbelievable, really an unbelievable, eye-opening thing, because it explains so many things. Anti-Semitism, certain aspects of anti-Semitism, that the world really understands the value of the Jews. And they can either look at the Jew and say, that's my example, that's my paradigm, which means that they have to make certain movements, they have to make certain changes in their lives. Or they can look at it and say, I'm not ready to make those changes. the only thing that I can do is to knock down the Jew. Because if I can knock him down, then he is no longer a paradigm for me. You know, in a lot of intellectual Judaism, we tend to take our greats and our giants and to reduce them and to take away some of their specialness. We love the fact that Aaron was involved in building the golden calf, because it makes it that I no longer have to look at Aaron as being a paradigm, because he had a great failure. If I could find the failure in Moshe, then Moshe is no longer my Rabbeinu. He's no longer my teacher. I'm not compelled anymore to be like him. If a rabbi who's saying a message that's making sense to me and that's touching me, if I'm not ready to move, then all I have to do is degrade him. All I have to do is to find the chink in his armor, and now I no longer have to pay attention. I no longer feel compelled by his message. This is something that is done around the world. It is done by everyone. It's a human reaction, but it's a human reaction. It's not the reaction of strength. It's not the reaction of power, of the potential strength and power that we have. And that's why the Torah doesn't tell me about the murder of Asaph, doesn't tell me about the idolatry, doesn't tell me about the adultery, because that stuff are outgrowths of something else. The only thing the Torah tells me about is Asaph selling the Bechora, and then caps that story with the most important words, Vayivez Asaph es ha-Bechora, that Asaph hated the Bechora. He didn't really hate the Bechora, but rather than deal with his own shortcomings, he turned it into hatred of the thing. And that's what the Torah is teaching me. That's the root of many of the issues and many of the problems that a person has. I think it's a pretty eye-opening concept, and I think that when a person looks a lot of times in their lives, they can recognize it sometimes in others, and more importantly, can recognize it in themselves, that there are times that we do things like that, that we readjust dreams and hopes and aspirations or disappointments. And in order so that we don't have to live with those disappointments, we remove the item. We say, I never really wanted that. It's not really a goal. I don't see it as a value. We push it down so that we don't have to feel compelled by it. We don't have to feel motivated and pushed by it. Okay, I'll leave you with one quick, beautiful idea. Another beautiful thing to say over the SHABBOS table. When it talks about the relationship between Rivka, and Yaakov, and between Yitzchak and Eisav, so the Torah says, Vayehav Yitzchak es Yaakov, Yitzchak loved Yaakov, ki tzayid b'fiv. Like in past tense, he loved him in the past because he was a tzayid b'fiv, because he put food in his mouth. V'Rivka oheves es Yaakov, and Rivka loves Yaakov. So if you look at the pasuk right away, you can see Vayehav, it's past tense, and oheves is present tense. So Yitzchak's love seems to be a past tense thing, and Rivka's love seems to be a present tense thing. By Yitzchak's love, it says ki. He loved him because. By Yaakov's love, it says V'Rivka oheves es Yaakov. She loves him. No ki, no because, nothing. The difference is that Yitzchak loved Yaakov because loved Asaph, because of what Asaph did. Rivka loved Yaakov because of who he was. There was once a rabbi that turned to a group of children and said, what do you want to be when you grow up? So a child said, lawyer, I want to be a doctor, I want to be a policeman. So he looked at them and he said, I didn't ask you what you want to do. I asked you what you want to be. Being and doing are not the same thing. Yet when you love someone for what they are, that love endures. When you love someone because of what they do, that love has no future. As our rabbis tell us, Ava tluya b'davar, love that is dependent upon a factor, batla davar, batla ava. When that thing no longer exists, the love no longer exists. And that's what the Torah is telling me. The Torah is teaching me that Yitzchak's love for Eisav was because of something, and therefore it was in the past. It was something that didn't last. It had no future. It had no kiyum. But Rivka oheves es Yaakov just because of who he was, not because of what he did. That kind of love that is based on the inside of a person, that's based on the intrinsic value of a person, not on what a person produces, but what a person is, that kind of love will endure forever. Okay, just a thought.